Welcome to our fun little study group for PP 5375 Economic Analysis for Public Policy and Management. These are the readings from Section '08, Monopoly.
And yet, deep dive really feels like the right term today. Our mission, essentially, is some pretty focused extraction. We're tackling two really big, distinct economic topics here.
That's right. Our source material is kind of split down the middle. We've got 11 notes Monopoly 1.pdf and also the 11 PPTX Monopoly.pdf. That's all pure, foundational market structure theory. And then we completely pivot. We jump over to 12 PPTX Immigration Policy 1.pdf, which is, well, it's very rigorous, data-heavy, applied policy analysis.
So the goal is to really cut through all that density and pull out the absolute core ideas, the mechanisms, and maybe most importantly, the policy implications for both of these very different areas.
It feels like a perfect exercise, actually, contrasting that clean theoretical model with the, let's say, messier reality of policy analysis.
Exactly. We need to get not just what happens in these markets, but also why government might step in, or sometimes why government action might even be the source of the issue itself.
Okay, let's dive in then, starting with that fundamental theoretical extreme, the economics of monopoly.
Right. So to really get monopoly, you've got to remember the baseline, the other extreme, perfect competition.
Yeah, the Econ 101 stuff. Loads of buyers, loads of sellers, everyone selling the exact same thing.
And critically, zero barriers to entry. Anyone can jump in, which means every single firm is just a price taker. They have to accept whatever the market price is.
And that competition is so fierce, right, that in the long run, any economic profit just gets competed away. Zero economic profit is the norm. It's like the peak of efficiency, theoretically speaking.
Monopoly, then, is the total opposite. The name itself, monopoly, means one seller.
Just one firm.
Just one. And because they're the only game in town, they are the price taker. They get to set the price. They have market power.
And that power means they can potentially earn real, positive economic profits and keep earning them, even in the long run.
Correct. The sources are really clear on the three defining traits for this structure.
Okay, what are they?
Well, the first two are pretty straightforward. One, they're the sole seller of the product.
Makes sense.
Two, there are no close substitutes. This is important. If you can easily switch to something else, say ditch cable for 5 different streaming services, then the original firm doesn't really have that monopoly power anymore.
Gotcha. So sole seller, no easy alternatives. What's the third?
The third is the absolute foundation, barriers to entry. Something has to physically stop other firms from entering the market and competing away those profits.
Okay, so without those barriers, any profit would just attract competitors and it wouldn't be a monopoly for long.
Precisely. If entry was easy, we'd drift back towards competition.
All right, let's unpack these barriers then, because how the monopoly gets formed seems crucial for how policymakers might react. The first one sounds simplest. Ownership of a key resource.
Yeah, this is the most direct way. If a single firm controls, say, the entire world's supply of a mineral needed to make something, well, game over for competitors.
Like the classic De Beers example with diamonds.
Yeah, exactly. For decades, they controlled a huge percentage of the world's diamond mines. If you can't get the raw material, you simply can't enter the market to compete. It's basic supply control.
Makes sense. Simple but effective. Okay, what's the second barrier? This sounds more complex. Natural monopoly, driven by high fixed costs and economies of scale.
Yes, and this is a really critical concept, especially for regulation. A natural monopoly happens when the firm's long-run average total cost, or ATC, just keeps falling as they produce more and more output over the whole relevant range of demand.
So the more they make, the cheaper it is per unit to make it.
Pretty much. And this typically happens when the upfront investment, the fixed cost, is absolutely massive. Think about laying infrastructure. Railway tracks, electrical grids, water pipes, maybe even cable lines back in the day.
Right, the cost of digging up every street in a city is enormous. But once the pipes are there, the cost of delivering one more gallon of water is tiny.
Exactly, and the implication is, well, it's counterintuitive. If the market demand is only large enough to support one firm producing efficiently at a low ATC, then splitting that production between two firms actually makes things worse.
How so?
Because if you split the market, say between firm A and firm B, each one produces less. And if ATC is falling, producing less means their average cost goes up, maybe from ATC 0 up to ATC 1 on the graph.
So having two water companies would mean duplicating that huge initial pipeline cost.
Doubling the fixed cost for society, essentially, with no real benefit. It becomes economically inefficient, wasteful to have competition in that specific infrastructure sense.
So weirdly, the efficient outcome in a natural monopoly might be to just have one producer.
From a cost perspective, yes, which is why governments often allow these monopolies to exist, think utilities. But, and this is a big but, they usually then step in to regulate the price.
To stop the single provider from just charging exorbitant prices.
Right. They might try to force the price down closer to average cost, maybe PATC, so the firm covers its costs but doesn't earn huge monopoly profits. It's trying to balance the efficiency of a single provider with protecting consumers.
Okay, that makes sense. A necessary evil, maybe, but regulated. Now, the third barrier sounds even stranger. Government-granted exclusive rights. The government creates a monopoly.
Yeah, this one feels paradoxical, doesn't it? The government actively steps in and says, you and only you can sell this product for a while. The most common examples are patents, usually 20 years for things like new drugs or technologies, and copyrights for creative works like books or music.
Well, why? If monopolies lead to inefficiency and deadweight loss, why would the government deliberately create one? It seems totally backwards.
It does, until you consider what market failure the government is trying to solve by creating the monopoly. Think about drug development.
Okay. Super expensive, takes years, lots of failures along the way.
Exactly. Imagine a company spends, say, $10 billion in a decade developing a life-saving drug. If, the moment it hits the market, any competitor could just analyze the chemical formula, which is relatively cheap to do, and start producing a generic version.
The original company would never make its money back. They took all the risk, all the upfront R&D cost.
And the competitors, with almost no R&D cost, could just sell at marginal cost, undercutting the innovator immediately.
So no company would ever bother spending that $10 billion in the first place. We wouldn't get the new drugs.
Precisely. The market failure isn't the potential monopoly. It's the lack of incentive for risky, expensive innovation. The patent is the government's tool to fix that. It grants a temporary monopoly, allowing the firm to charge a price above marginal cost for, say, 20 years.
Long enough, hopefully, for them to recoup those massive R&D fixed costs and make a profit, rewarding the innovation.
Right. It's an explicit trade-off society makes. We accept higher drug prices and some inefficiency for a limited time.
In exchange for actually getting the drug invented at all.
Exactly. And that's why, the day the patent expires, you see generic versions flood the market and the price plummets. The R&D cost has been paid off. Now it's just about the marginal cost of production. Hashtag 3. Profit maximization for the price setter.
Okay, so we understand how monopolies form resource control, natural cost structures, or government grant. Now, how do they actually behave? How do they decide how much to produce and what price to charge? This must be different from the competitive guys.
Totally different. Remember, the competitive firm faces a perfectly flat horizontal demand curve. They can sell as much as they want at the market price. Their actions don't move the needle.
But the monopolist is the market.
Right, so they face the entire downward-sloping market demand curve. If they want to sell one more unit, they have to lower the price to entice that next customer.
And that immediately breaks the rule from perfect competition, where price equals marginal revenue.
PMR.
It absolutely does.
The monopolist still follows the fundamental profit-maximizing rule, produce, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, MRMC. That rule holds for all firms.
Okay, MRMC is universal. But why is price different from marginal revenue for the monopolist? Why is PMR always true for them?
It comes down to two effects happening simultaneously when they lower the price to sell one additional unit. Let's call them the quantity effect and the price effect.
Okay.
The quantity effect is positive. They sell one more unit, and they get the revenue from that unit at the new, lower price. Good so far.
But there's a catch.
Yes, the price effect, and this is the crucial part. To sell that extra unit, they had to lower the price. But they can't just lower the price for the new customer. They have to lower it for all the customers who are already willing to pay the higher price.
Ah, so if they were selling, say, 10 widgets at $10 each, and they dropped the price to $9 to sell an 11th widget.
They gain $9 from selling that 11th widget, quantity effect, but they lose $1 in revenue on each of the first 10 widgets they were already selling, price effect. That's a $10 loss.
Wow. So the gain was $9, but the loss on the previous units was $10. The net change in revenue, the marginal revenue, is actually negative $1.
Exactly. Even though the price is $9, the marginal revenue of selling that 11th unit is minus $1. The price effect swamps the quantity effect in that instance.
That's a huge gap between P and MR, and it explains why the MR curve on the standard graph is always below the demand curve.
Precisely. And mathematically, for a straight line linear demand curve, the MR curve isn't just below it. It's always exactly twice as steep. It falls faster because of that price effect hitting all the previous units.
Okay, let's make this concrete. The notes have that example, figure 3 or table 1. Can we walk through finding the profit maximizing point? Let's say marginal cost, MC, is flat at $2.
Sure. So the monopolist looks for where their MR curve hits that MC level of $2. You scan down the MR column or find the intersection on the graph. In that example, MR equals MC, $2, at a quantity of 3.5 units. Let's call that Q.
So Q equals 3.5. That's the quantity they decide to produce. But they don't charge $2, right?
Definitely not. They charge the highest price the market will bear for that quantity. So from Q 3.5, you go vertically up to the demand curve.
Reading off the demand curve tells you what people are willing to pay.
Exactly. And in that specific example, the demand curve at Q 3.5 corresponds to a price of T equals $7.50.
So produce 3.5 units, sell them each for $7.50. That's the monopoly price and quantity.
That's the profit maximizing choice. Now, to calculate the actual profit.
Profit is always quantity times price minus average cost, right? PAC is a profit per unit.
Correct. So if we look at the example again, let's say the average cost AC of producing 3.5 units happens to be $5. Then the profit is Q times PAC.
Which is 3.5 units multiplied by $7.50 price minus $5 average cost.
Which gives you 3.5 times $2.50, $8.75. That's their economic profit. And visually on the graph, like figure 4, that profit is represented by the rectangle bounded by P, AC, and Q.
And because of those barriers to entry we talked about, they can potentially keep earning that $8.75 profit period after period, unlike the poor competitive firm.
That's the power of being the price setter. #tag for monopoly and social welfare, deadweight loss.
Okay, so they make profit. But why should we, as society, care? This profit comes at a cost, doesn't it? This is where deadweight loss comes in.
Absolutely. This is the core reason economists generally view monopoly as inefficient. We always need that benchmark. What would happen under perfect competition?
In competition, the market produces where supply, which is the sum of firms' MC curves, intersects demand. Let's call that QEFF, the efficient quantity. Price equals MC there. Total surplus consumer plus producer is maximized.
Right. But the monopolist, as we just saw, chooses to produce where MRMC. And because PMR, they always choose a quantity QM that is less than the efficient quantity QEFF.
And to sell that lower quantity QM, they charge a price PM that is higher than the competitive price PEFF. So less stuff, higher price. That sounds bad.
It is. From a social welfare perspective, let's look at the surplus analysis, maybe using figure 5 from the source material. Under competition, consumers enjoy a large surplus. Under monopoly, that consumer surplus shrinks dramatically, maybe just to areas A plus B in the diagram.
Okay, consumers lose out. But what happens to the surplus they lose? Where does it go? The diagram shows areas C and D.
Right. C and D represent the extra money that consumers who still buy the good now have to pay because the price went up from PEFF to PM. This portion isn't lost to society, it's just transferred.
Transferred from consumers.
Directly into the monopolist's pocket as producer surplus, profit. So C plus D is a loss for consumers, a gain for the producer. From society's overall perspective, it's kind of a wash. A redistribution, not a destruction of value.
Okay, so C plus D isn't the real problem, it's just a transfer. Where's the actual loss, the deadweight loss?
The true social cost, the deadweight loss, is represented by those triangle areas, usually labeled E and H in these diagrams.
Why are E and H lost completely?
Because the monopolist chooses not to produce the units of output between QM and the efficient level QEFF. For every single one of those units not produced, the value to the potential consumer, shown by the height of the demand curve, is still higher than the cost to produce it, shown by the height of the MC curve.
So there are trades that could have happened where both a buyer and the seller would have been better off.
But they don't happen because the monopolist restricts output to keep the price high. That potential surplus just vanishes. It's unrealized gains from trade.
So E represents the lost surplus for consumers who would have bought between QM and QEFF at a lower price, but are priced out by PM.
And H represents the lost potential profit, producer surplus. The monopolist could have earned by selling those extra units if they hadn't restricted output. Both E and H are gone. Poof. That's the inefficiency, the deadweight loss to society. #Check5. Public policy toward monopoly.
Okay, so monopolies lead to higher prices, lower output, and this deadweight loss, this destruction of potential value. It seems natural that governments would want to do something about it.
Exactly. And that leads us to antitrust law. This is the primary government response aimed at curbing monopoly power and promoting competition.
These are the big laws, like the
Mm.
Sherman Act from way back in 1890 and the Clayton Act a bit later in 1917.
Those are the cornerstones, yes. They provide the legal basis for the government to intervene in markets that are becoming too concentrated or where firms are engaging in anti-competitive behavior.
And what kind of tools does government actually use?
Well, the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission have a few key tools. They review proposed mergers and acquisitions. If they think a merger, say between two big airlines or tech companies, would substantially reduce competition and give the combined firm too much market power, they can block it.
So preventing monopolies before they form?
That's a major part of it, yeah. They can also, though it's rarer and more complex, move to break up existing dominant firms that are deemed to be abusing their monopoly position.
Like the old AT&T breakup.
That's the classic example.
Yeah.
And finally, they can prosecute and impose hefty fines on firms that collude, things like illegal price-fixing agreements, where supposed competitors secretly agree to charge high prices.
So the overall goal of antitrust policy is really to push the market outcome back towards that competitive ideal, GMC, and shrink or eliminate that deadweight loss triangle.
That's the fundamental economic rationale behind it. Restore competition, restore efficiency.
All right. So the monopoly story is one where firms have power, they restrict output, create inefficiency, and policy, like antitrust, tries to push back towards efficiency. Sometimes it works. Sometimes, like with natural monopolies, it's more about regulation than elimination.
That's a good summary, and it provides a really interesting pivot point for us. If government sometimes intervenes to fix market failures like monopoly, or even creates temporary monopolies like patents to solve other failures like lack of R&D.
Then what happens when a major shock hits a different kind of market? The labor market, often influenced by government policy itself, like immigration.
Exactly. How does economic analysis help us understand the impacts of government action or inaction when it comes to the flow of people across borders? This takes us squarely into our second set of readings.
Let's make that sharp turn then. We're now drawing entirely from the 12 PPTX immigration policy, 1.pdf source. Where should we start? Maybe with the big picture, the fundamental issues and demographic shifts. Hashtag 6, fundamental issues and demographic shifts.
Yeah, the context is crucial here because the nature of immigration to the U.S. has changed dramatically over time.
Yeah.
If you go back to, say, 1910, something like 95% of the foreign-born population came from Europe or Canada.
Wow, almost entirely European? How does that compare to today?
It's basically flipped. The source material indicates that today around 81% of the foreign-born population comes from Latin America, the Caribbean, and Asia, a massive shift in origins.
And does that shift in origin correspond to a shift in, like, skills or education levels?
It does, and it's created a really interesting pattern. Compared to the U.S.-born population, immigrants today are, on average, both more likely to have very high levels of education, advanced degrees, PhDs, and more likely to have very low levels of formal education, like less than a high school diploma.
So it's not just an average shift, it's more like the distribution has spread out at both ends, a sort of bimodal distribution.
Exactly, highly heterogeneous. But despite this complexity in skills, when you look at the overall macroeconomic impact, the picture presented in the readings is generally positive.
Positive how?
On average, the study suggests immigrants tend to improve overall U.S. living standards. They also seem to raise the average wages of native-born workers slightly. The estimates mentioned are somewhere between a 0.1% and 0.6% gain.
So a small positive bump for natives on average. What about the fiscal impact, like taxes paid versus services used?
Over their lifetimes, the data suggests immigrants are, again, on average, a net positive for the federal budget. They tend to pay more in taxes than they consume in benefits, especially when you factor in the typically strong economic performance and tax contributions of their children, the second generation.
Okay, so the averages look pretty good, but averages can hide a lot, can't they? The real political heat seems to be around the impact on specific groups of native workers, not the overall average.
Precisely. That positive average doesn't mean everyone's wages go up. And that's where the economic theory gets crucial understanding who might be substitutes and who might be complements. Hashtag 7. The theoretical effect on native wages, substitutes versus complements.
Right. So how does the basic theory predict immigration will affect native wages? Let's start simple, maybe in the short run, where the amount of capital machines, factories, etc. is fixed.
Okay, the simplest case is if the incoming immigrant workers are perfect substitutes for existing native workers. meaning they have the same skills, they do the same jobs.
Like identical puzzle pieces.
Pretty much. In this case, immigration is just a pure increase in the supply of labor. The labor supply curve shifts to the right from S1 to S2.
And basic supply and demand tells us, if supply goes up and demand stays the same, the price of the wage has to fall.
Exactly. Wages fall, say, from W1 down to W2. And importantly, at that lower wage, some native workers might choose to work less or leave the labor force. So native employment could also decrease, maybe from L1 down to LN. This is the standard competition story, the one that often fuels concerns.
Okay, that's the substitutes case. What if they're not substitutes? What if they're complements?
This is the alternative. If immigrant workers have skills that complement those of native workers, maybe they specialize in different tasks that, when combined, make everyone more productive, then their arrival can actually increase the demand for native workers.
How would that work? Like maybe immigrants take on more manual tasks, freeing up natives to focus on communication-based tasks where they have an advantage.
That's a great example of complementarity through task specialization. If immigrants increase native productivity, the demand curve for native labor shifts to the right, say D1 to D2. And in that scenario, native wages would actually rise.
So theoretically, immigration could either lower native wages if substitutes or raise them if complements, at least in the short run.
Correct. But now we need to think about the long run. The defining feature of the long run in economics is that capital is not fixed. Firms can invest, build more factories, buy more machines.
How does allowing capital to adjust change things? Let's go back to the substitutes case where wages initially fall.
Okay, so short-run wages fall. This makes labor cheaper relative to capital. What does that do to the incentive to invest in capital?
Well, if labor is cheap, using capital looks relatively more expensive. Wait, no. If labor is cheap, the profits from employing that cheap labor with capital go up, so the return to capital should increase.
Exactly. Lower wages mean higher returns for the owners of capital. And what happens when the return on investment goes up?
People invest more. Firms build those new factories, buy the new machines. The capital stock expands.
Right. And as the capital stock grows, what does it do to the productivity of workers?
More machines per worker usually means each worker is more productive, their marginal product goes up.
Which pushes their wages back up. This is the crucial long-run adjustment mechanism. As investment pours in, attracted by the higher returns, the capital stock grows. If it grows enough so that the overall capital-to-labor ratio, KL in the economy, returns to its original level,
then the marginal product of labor should also return to its original level. And if wages are tied to marginal product?
then the native wage should also return to its initial pre-immigration level. The economy is now larger, more people, more capital, but the relative price of labor can stabilize.
Wow. So even if immigrants are perfect substitutes and push wages down initially, the theory suggests that in the long run, capital adjusts and wages should recover.
That's the standard neoclassical long-run prediction, assuming things like constant returns to scale and mobile capital. It suggests even the negative short-run effects might be temporary. #8. Empirical evidence on wage impact.
Okay, the long-run theory sounds pretty reassuring, but we know policy debates happen in the here and now. What does the actual empirical evidence say about the wage impact? Does it match the short-run fear or the long-run recovery?
Well, as you might expect, the evidence is messy. It's definitely not clear-cut. You find economists reaching different conclusions, often depending on how they define substitutability and how long they consider the long run to be.
Can you give an example of that disagreement?
Sure. The reading has mentioned contrasting estimates like those from George Borjas, who often finds more negative impacts, particularly for low-skilled natives, versus researchers like Gianmarco Ottaviano and Giovanni Peri, whose work often suggests smaller, sometimes even slightly positive, average wage impacts for natives.
Why do they get different answers from presumably similar data?
A lot hinges on the assumptions. For instance, if you assume immigrants primarily compete only with natives who have the exact same level of education and experience a very narrow definition of substitutability, you tend to find larger negative wage effects for those specific native groups.
Especially for those with the fewest unique skills, like maybe high school dropouts.
Exactly. That group consistently shows the most negative effects across studies, though the estimated size varies a lot. The readings mention estimates ranging from maybe -1.7% all the way down to -8.1%. That wide range itself tells you how sensitive the results are to the modeling choices.
So if you define the groups narrowly, you see more competition. What if you allow for more flexibility, like that task specialization idea?
Right. If you allow for the possibility that natives adjust, maybe shifting to different tasks or industries where they don't directly compete, then the estimated negative impacts get much smaller. And you might even find positive effects for other groups due to complementarities. Ottaviano and Perry's work often emphasizes this flexibility.
It sounds like trying to isolate the true effect is really hard. Are there other ways to study this? Maybe ways that don't rely so heavily on those substitutability assumptions?
Yes, economists love natural experiments for this reason. These are situations where something happens in the real world that mimics a controlled experiment, like a sudden, unexpected surge of immigration to one specific place.
Oh, like the Mariel boat lift.
That's the most famous one in this field. In 1980, Fidel Castro unexpectedly allowed about 125,000 Cubans to leave the port of Mariel, and most of them landed in Miami over just a few months.
That must have been a huge shock to Miami's labor market.
Enormous. It increased the city's labor force by about 7% almost overnight, and many of the Marielitos were relatively low-skilled. It looked like a perfect test case for the short-run substitution model.
So, what did David Card find when he studied it back in 1990? Did wages plummet in Miami compared to similar cities?
Surprisingly, no. Card compared Miami's wage and unemployment trends to similar cities like Atlanta, Houston, LA, places that didn't get the sudden influx. His finding was pretty stunning at the time. The boat lift had no discernible impact on the wages or unemployment rates of Miami's existing low-skilled workers, including groups like non-Cuban Hispanics or black workers, who were thought to be the most likely substitutes.
Wow, so the simple story of more supply means lower price didn't really hold up in that case.
It seems not. Or at least the market absorbed the influx much more smoothly and quickly than the simple model predicted. Maybe through rapid expansion of industries that use their labor, or maybe that task specialization happened very fast. It really shifted the debate.
And does that finding hold up more generally? What if you look at lots of studies?
Well, the readings mention meta-analysis studies that combine the results of many different immigration wage impact studies. And the general finding from those is that the average effect of immigration on average native wages across all studies is very, very small, statistically often indistinguishable from zero.
So lots of variation, maybe some negative effects for specific low-skilled groups in the short run, but on average, not much impact.
That seems to be the broad consensus, yes. Which leads back to trying to understand why. Why isn't the simple competition effect stronger? And the idea of specialization versus competition seems key.
How does the U.S. experience compare to elsewhere? You mentioned the U.K. earlier.
Right. The source mentions a study by Dustman and others from 2013 looking at the UK. They found that even highly educated immigrants often ended up working in lower-wage jobs initially, maybe due to language issues or difficulty getting credentials recognized.
So they ended up competing more directly with low-wage native workers.
That's what the study suggested. And the result was a fairly sharp negative impact on the wages of native workers at the very bottom of the wage distribution, below the 20th percentile, even though the average effect across all natives was slightly positive.
Okay, so direct competition at the low end in the UK. How does the U.S. differ, according to the research cited?
The Perry and Sparber study from 2009 offers a compelling explanation for the U.S. They found evidence that less educated foreign-born workers tend to specialize in jobs requiring more manual or physical skills.
Okay.
And in response, less educated native-born workers tend to shift towards jobs that require more communication or language-intensive skills areas where, as native English speakers, they have a comparative advantage.
Ah, so they don't compete head-to-head. They sort of move into different complementary roles.
Exactly. The labor market effectively reallocates tasks based on comparative advantage. This specialization means less direct wage pressure on low-skilled natives than you might otherwise expect, and it could even boost overall productivity. #####9. Impact beyond wages, prices, and growth.
This task specialization idea is fascinating. But okay, even if the direct wage effects are small on average, are there other economic impacts we need to consider? The analysis can't just stop at wages, can it?
Absolutely not. We need to think about total purchasing power, which means considering not just wages, but also the price effect.
The price effect? You mean how immigration might affect the cost of goods and services?
Precisely, especially for services that use a lot of the kind of labor that immigrants often provide. Think about things like childcare, gardening, construction, restaurant meals, house cleaning.
If immigration increases the supply of labor for those jobs, potentially lowering the labor cost, shouldn't the price of those services also fall?
That's the logic. And the readings highlight Patricia Cortez's 2009 study, which looked exactly at this. She examined if low-skilled immigration led to lower prices for services that intensively use low-skilled labor.
How did she make sure she was measuring the effect of immigration itself, and not just that immigrants go to booming cities where prices might be rising anyway? That sounds tricky.
It is tricky. It's the classic correlation versus causation problem. Cortez used a clever approach called an instrumental variable strategy. She used the historical settlement patterns of immigrants from the 1970s to predict where new immigrants would likely settle decades later.
Why does using the old patterns help?
Because those historical patterns are likely related to where immigrants settle today. People tend to go where their compatriots already are, but they're not directly related to the current economic boom in a city. It helps isolate the effect of the immigrant supply shock itself from other ongoing economic trends.
Ingenious. So what did she find? Does low-skilled immigration lower prices for things like childcare?
Yes, quite significantly. Her estimate was that a 10% increase in the share of low-skilled immigrants in a city's population led to a 6.3% decrease in the price of services that use low-skilled labor intensively.
Wow, a 6.3% price drop. That's a pretty big gain for consumers buying those services.
It is, and it affects everyone who consumes those services, regardless of their own skill level or wage. So now we can put the wage and price effects together to get a sense of the net impact on purchasing power.
Okay, let's do that. For low-skilled natives, maybe their wages fell slightly.
Right, the estimates varied, but let's say a small negative wage effect, but they also benefit from these lower prices. Cortez calculated the net effect. For low-skilled natives, the negative wage effects slightly outweighed the positive price effect, leading to a small net reduction in their purchasing power, estimated between about 0.4% and 1.1%.
So a small net loss for them. What about higher-skilled natives, say those with high school or college degrees?
Well, their wages weren't negatively affected, maybe even slightly positively affected by complementarity, but they still benefit from the lower prices on services. So for them, it's a clear net gain in purchasing power. Cortez estimated the average net benefit for the overall native population, combining everyone, was positive, around plus 0.21%.
Interesting. So considering prices really changes the distributional picture. Okay, wage effects, price effects. What else? Does immigration affect overall economic growth?
Yes, and this is potentially a really big one. Economists often look at total factor productivity, or TFP, which is basically a measure of the economy's overall efficiency, how much output we get from our inputs of capital and labor. It captures things like technological progress and better organization.
And how does immigration fit in?
High-skilled immigration, in particular, seems to be a significant driver of innovation. Studies show links between high-skilled immigrants and increased patenting rates, entrepreneurship, and scientific advancement.
Makes sense, bringing in scientists, engineers, entrepreneurs.
Right. But even less skilled immigration can boost TFP. Remember that task specialization idea?
Yeah, natives moving to communication tasks, immigrants to manual tasks.
If that specialization allows the economy to organize production more efficiently, using everyone's skills more effectively, that shows up as an increase in total factor productivity. The whole economy becomes more productive.
So the Perry study mentioned from 2012 looked at this across U.S. states.
Yes, over a long period, from the 1960s to the 2000s. And it found a significant and positive link between immigration inflows and the growth rate of TFP in those states. More immigration was associated with faster efficiency growth. #10, intergenerational mobility, the long-term view.
Okay, so we have complex short-run wage effects, clearer long-run wage stability due to capital adjustment, beneficial price effects, and positive impacts on productivity and growth. That's already a much richer picture than just wages go down. But what about the really long term? Like, what happens to the children of immigrants?
This is where the story gets perhaps even more compelling, moving beyond immediate impacts to intergenerational mobility. How well do the children of immigrants fare compared to the children of native-born parents?
The readings mention a major study on this by Abramitsky, Booston, and others from 2021. What did they do?
It's quite remarkable research. They managed to link historical U.S. Census records over an incredibly long period, from 1880 all the way to 2015. This allowed them to track millions of father-son pairs across generations.
Tracking families over 135 years, what were they looking for?
They wanted to see if the children of immigrants climbed the economic ladder faster or slower than the children of U.S.-born fathers who started at roughly the same economic level.
And what was the main finding? Does the American dream work for immigrants' kids?
Overwhelmingly, yes. The study found that consistently across this vast historical period, and despite huge changes in immigration policy and the countries immigrants came from, the children of immigrants from almost every sending country experienced higher rates of upward economic mobility than the children of U.S.-born parents.
Higher rates. So they didn't just catch up, they often surpassed kids from native families who started at a similar income level.
That's exactly what the data showed. Second-generation immigrants tended to overtake their counterparts.
Why? What explains that consistent pattern of higher mobility over centuries? Did the study offer any mechanisms?
They identified a couple of key factors. First, immigrant families tended to be more geographically mobile within the U.S. They were significantly more likely to move to locations, counties, or states that offered better economic opportunities and better schools for their children compared to native-born families of similar means. They were more proactive in seeking out prosperous environments.
So better location choices were part of it. What else?
The second factor was something they termed parental underplacement in the income distribution.
Underplacement. What does that mean?
It means the immigrant father's current job and income might not have fully reflected his actual skills or potential, maybe due to language barriers, discrimination, or difficulty getting foreign credentials recognized. Think of the classic example, the doctor from overseas driving a taxi upon arrival.
Okay, so his income looks low, but his underlying human capital or drive might be much higher.
Exactly. But his children, growing up in the U.S., speaking native English, going through the U.S. school system, they don't face those same initial barriers. They can leverage the inherent advantages passed down from their parents, maybe work ethic, aspirations, skills, much more effectively.
So, relative to a native family with the same observed low income, the immigrant children had more potential to draw upon, giving them more scope for upward mobility.
That appears to be a major part of this story. The second generation benefits from both the locational choices of their parents and their ability to overcome the initial underplacement their parents might have faced. It suggests a very powerful long-term dynamism associated with immigration. Hashtag outro. We've really covered a huge amount of ground today. Started with the pure theory of monopoly, that static model where P being greater than MR leads the firm to restrict output to QM, causing that deadweight loss, those E and H triangles that antitrust policy aims to tackle.
Yeah, a clear case of market power leading to inefficiency. And then we jumped into the, frankly, much more complex and dynamic world of immigration's impact on labor markets. We saw how those simple short-run substitution models predicting wage drops get complicated really fast by long-run capital adjustments.
And by things like task specialization, which seems particularly important in the U.S. context, according to researchers like Perry and Sparber, not to mention the price effects and the productivity gains.
It feels like the thread connecting these two very different topics, monopoly and immigration, is maybe this idea of economic adjustment over time and the role of policy in navigating it.
I think that's right. There's often this friction, this trade-off between what happens right now, the short-run effects, and the longer-run outcomes or efficiencies.
We literally saw the government create an inefficient monopoly with patents. Why? Because that short-term inefficiency was seen as a necessary catalyst to solve a bigger long-run problem, the lack of incentive for R&D.
And similarly with immigration, the analysis suggests that while there are complex, sometimes negative short-term wage effects for specific groups, the broader, longer-term picture includes offsetting price benefits, significant boost to overall productivity, and this really impressive intergenerational upward mobility.
So it leads to a kind of provocative final thought for you, the listener, as you digest all this. It seems like effective public policy, drawing on this kind of economic analysis, often isn't about finding the perfect, painless solution today.
Maybe it's more about identifying and managing necessary short-term frictions, whether that's temporary monopoly power or some wage volatility or the cost of investing in new infrastructure, because those frictions are the very things that might drive the system towards much larger, more widely shared benefits down the road.
So the question becomes, what other examples are out there? Where else do we see policy analysts arguing that we need to accept some kind of acknowledged short-term pain or inefficiency, maybe in environmental policy or education reform or deficit spending, because it's considered the essential price we have to pay to unlock a significantly better, more prosperous, or more equitable long-term future? That feels like the core challenge, doesn't it? Applying this economic toolkit to make those tough, long-run judgments.